Today, I'm going to share 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them, I will share the photo that is famously associated with that story.
But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace all of the like button's toilet paper with duct tape. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At 1 p.m. on November 2nd, 2020, an older man named Marcel Terray stood in his backyard hanging damp clothes on a clothesline. Marcel and his wife, 83-year-old Paulette Landru, lived on a quiet street in the small city of Anden, Belgium. And usually, their days were filled with household chores or visits from their kids. But over the last few months, Marcel had started to spend a lot more time taking care of his wife because she had recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia that causes memory loss and confusion. And so Paulette needed help remembering to eat or to take her medications on time. And sometimes she would just wander off without telling Marcel, and Marcel would have to go corral her and bring her back home. For Marcel, watching his wife struggle with this disease was absolutely heartbreaking, and so he did everything in his power to make her life as comfortable and happy as he possibly could. And so before he had come out to hang up the laundry, he had made sure to set his wife up in front of the TV with a nice lunch so she could eat and watch her favorite show. And so Marcel hung up the last piece of clothing and then picked up the empty laundry basket and headed back towards the house. When he went inside, he expected to see his wife still sitting on the couch watching TV, but she wasn't there anymore. Marcel immediately began calling out his wife's name, but she didn't call back. And then he searched the whole house and he couldn't find her. And so starting to panic, he went outside, he searched the outside of the house, she wasn't there. He even knocked on some neighbors' doors, but they hadn't seen her. And so at this point, Marcel was very scared given the fact that his wife had Alzheimer's and could easily wander off and put herself in a very dangerous situation without even knowing. And so instead of waiting any longer to just hope she showed up again, he picked up the phone and he called the police. Less than an hour later, Marcel stood outside of his house looking at helicopters flying overhead, and he knew at least half a dozen officers were spread out around the neighborhood, knocking on neighbors' doors. There were canine units searching the surrounding area. This huge search, it was all for Paulette. Marcel was glad to see that clearly the police had taken the search very seriously, and so he was confident that they would find his wife and that hopefully she'd be okay. But the hours kept ticking by, and as the sun began to go down, there still was no sign of Paulette. A police officer told Marcel that they would keep on investigating and hopefully find his wife as soon as possible. But over the next few days and weeks, Paulette didn't turn up, nobody had any idea where she was, and before long, weeks turned into months, and then months turned into 2 full years that nobody had seen Paulette. And by that point, Marcel had basically resigned himself to the fact that he very likely would die without ever figuring out what happened to his wife. But then, one day in early October of 2022, so 2 years after Paulette went missing, one of Marcel and Paulette's neighbors was at home on their computer looking at a particular website. And as they were scrolling through this website, they happened upon an image that as soon as they saw it, they froze. Because this neighbor was very well aware of the fact that Paulette had gone missing and nobody had found her. But now they're seeing this image on this website that basically gives away what happened to her. And so totally shocked that they had even found this image, the neighbor screenshotted it and brought it to the police. So it would turn out that neighbor was looking at Google Street View, which is a feature of Google Maps that basically allows you to see 360-degree views of basically anywhere on the planet. To create these images, Google literally sends out these special vehicles all over the world that have cameras that sit on top of the cars. And these cars drive down basically all the streets all over the place, constantly taking pictures all around them. And it just so happened on the exact day that Paulette went missing in 2020, there happened to be a Google car driving down the road that captured a picture of her. And so as you can see in the picture of her, you see Paulette on the left side of the image walking across the street away from her home, which is on the right side. And on the right side, you can actually see Marcel in the backyard hanging up laundry on the clothesline. And so the police, after getting this image, they basically followed the projected route Paulette was on, which is basically beelining straight across the road. And they found that across the street was this steep hill that led down to this thick bramble bush. and inside of that bramble bush was Paulette, and she was deceased. And so very likely, Paulette, in her confused state, walked straight across the street, as we see in the image, and then fell down that hill and got trapped at the bottom inside of that bramble bush and couldn't move. And so when that huge search for her was going on, very likely she was just trapped down there, but didn't understand what was going on, couldn't necessarily yell up to communicate with anybody, and so she stayed down there and died. And unfortunately, it would take 2 more full years and a random image on Google Street View before Marcel could finally get the closure he needed.
Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. I've talked a lot about how therapy really helped me when I left the military in 2017. It took time, but I went from being this very angry person who was struggling with depression to feeling like I was at peace and content again. And today, part of the reason I still consider myself to be very well adjusted is because of the skills I have learned in therapy. The most important skill that I find myself leaning on most days is self-awareness, something I definitely lacked pre-therapy. Now I'm very in tune with how I feel and how it affects me personally, but also how it affects the people around me. Like, my mood and behavior can have an enormous effect on my friends and family, and I need to be aware of that. And so that self-awareness kind of keeps me from spiraling when I start to struggle. So while therapy is certainly not a one-size-fits-all solution, I do think it's a great starting point for anybody who's struggling. And while therapy can be costly, there are affordable options, such as online therapy platforms like BetterHelp. BetterHelp is on a mission to make starting therapy easier. All you have to do is fill out a quick questionnaire, and then you'll be paired up with a licensed BetterHelp therapist within a couple of days. One of the best features of BetterHelp is that if the first therapist does not feel like the right fit, you can continue to switch therapists until you find someone you really connect with, and it's at no additional cost. So really, BetterHelp is trying to find the right person for you. So if you're struggling right now and you think you might benefit from a therapy session, click the link in the description below or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen for 10% off your first month of therapy. Okay, back to the story.
Around 10 a.m. on July 26, 2015, a 31-year-old mom named Xiang Lu Xuan and her husband chased their 2-year-old son around a brand new indoor playground. This playground was on the 6th floor of a mall in Jingzhou City, which is in central China. And so Xiang and her husband had come to this mall today just so their son could basically enjoy this playground. And currently he was running around in circles and laughing hysterically. He thought it was great. Xiang caught up to her son and scooped him up and then placed him at the top of a slide. And he happily slid down to the bottom, and when he reached the bottom, Xiang was waiting for him, and the son, he just stopped and looked past her and pointed and started saying, "Ride, ride." And so Xiang, she turned around and she saw right behind them were these 2 escalators, one going up and one going down. And so Xiang realized her son clearly thought these escalators were maybe a part of this playground. And so he wanted to go use them. They were a fun attraction. And so Xiang smiled and took her son's hand and then told her husband they're going to go ride the ride, the escalators. And then they began walking over. Once Xiang and her son actually reached the escalator, suddenly her son was not as keen to hop on board. He was nervous. But Xiang, who had ridden escalators many times before, told her son it's totally safe, and she kind of coaxed him to do it, and eventually he stepped on right alongside her, holding her hand, and about halfway up the escalator, when she was confident her son would be okay, Xiang turned around and looked up towards the top of the escalator, the 7th floor where they were going. And she saw 3 mall employees at the top of the escalator on the 7th floor where they were going. And they were clearly looking at Xiang with a very serious look on their faces, and they were gesturing at something towards the top of the escalator. It seemed like they could be warning her about something or simply pointing something out. She wasn't really sure. And so she looked up at them like, what's going on here? But the 3 mall employees just didn't do a good job communicating whatever was going on or whatever issue they were dealing with. And so as a result, Xiang and her son just continued riding up the escalator, and as they got closer and closer, these mall employees continued to gesture at something happening on the 7th floor just beyond the escalator, and Xiang still totally confused. And then finally, when Xiang and her son reached the top and stepped off, Xiang suddenly understood what these employees were referencing. But by now, it was too late. Moments later, Jiang's husband, who was still down below on the 6th floor at the playground, he heard the sound of his wife and son screaming over near the escalator. And so instinctively, he bolted over to the escalator. He didn't see his wife, didn't see his son, and he began going up the escalator when someone at the top screamed at him to stop and get off the escalator. And so he did, and right then a mall employee came running down the other side carrying his son, and this person handed the son over to Jiang's husband. And this employee, who clearly was completely shocked by whatever had happened up above, just shook their head. It would turn out, earlier that day, those mall employees who were at the top gesturing to Jiang, they had discovered a defect with the metal platform that sits right at the top of the escalator on the 7th floor. Basically, when you get off this escalator, it's the platform you step onto first. They had found there was something wrong with it. It wasn't stable. But instead of immediately blocking off the escalator to make sure nobody walked on it and then go get it repaired, these employees just kind of nonchalantly allowed the escalator to continue, stationed a couple of them at the top to make sure nobody, used the escalator, and then called for a repairman. But the repairman hadn't shown up and fixed this problem by the time Jiang and her son boarded the escalator. And these employees at the top knew there's this huge issue with the platform they're going to step on the second they get off, but they failed to communicate the danger to Jiang and her son as they were coming up. They just kind of broadly gesticulated that there was some issue up here and to sort of watch out for it, but Jiang had no idea. And so by the time she got to the top and stepped off the escalator onto that platform, well, the defect with the platform is that it caved in with any weight. And so she fell into the escalator, where the teeth of the escalator was rotating, and as she was getting pulled in to her death, her final moment captured on video as she took her son and thrusted him to the employees, saving his life before she disappeared and died inside the inner workings of the escalator. Following Jiang's death, there was a full-scale investigation, and quickly there were massive safety failures identified on the part of the company who made the escalator and also on the mall itself. 2 people were ultimately arrested in connection with Jiang's death and these safety failures, and the mall reportedly offered to pay some settlement to Jiang's family. However, the details of that settlement have not been made public. One morning in November of 1997, a police captain named Jeffrey Lewis, along with his partner, parked their squad car near the Manatee River in Bradenton, Florida, which is a small city just south of Tampa. A few minutes earlier, the Bradenton Police Department had received a call from this frantic man who had said he had found something suspicious that had washed up on the shore of this river. And so Captain Lewis and his partner were there to investigate. And so as soon as they got out of their squad car, this man who had called the police, he saw them and waved them down, and he was pointing at something in the sand. And so Captain Lewis and his partner, they walked over, and before they even talked to this guy, they just looked down at what he was pointing at, and right away they could see why he called the police. Because there, sitting on the sand, was a severed human hand. And so the instant Captain Lewis saw this, his first thought was actually just alligators, because there were alligators that swam in the Manatee River, and people were told about them and were told, not to go swimming here, but people still did. And so his thought was, well, maybe one of the alligators got a swimmer. However, when Captain Lewis looked at the hand more closely, he could tell right away that that probably did not happen, because where the hand had been cut off from the body, the cut was almost surgical. It was very, very neat, whereas if an alligator had ripped the hand off, it would be rough. But this almost looked like a surgeon had carefully removed the hand. And so what this signaled to Captain Lewis is this hand very likely represented a murder victim. Somebody who killed this person, cut their body up, and one of their body parts is now washed ashore. And so Captain Lewis turned to his partner and told him to call for backup. And within an hour, police officers were scouring the Manatee River looking for the body that belonged to this hand. Meanwhile, the captain bagged this hand as evidence and brought it to the county sheriff's crime lab, hoping that forensic experts could potentially figure out who the victim was using fingerprints. However, when he actually handed over the hand to these forensic technicians, they told Captain Lewis that it was very likely going to be impossible to try to pull prints from this hand because the hand was very badly decomposed and water damaged. But they told Captain Lewis that despite this being a total long shot, they would still give it a try. And so really all Captain Lewis had was this hand, and so he just kind of waited for information from the crime lab about the fingerprints. And before long, the waiting went from days to weeks to months with no fingerprints. And so with no fingerprints and no other breakthroughs in this case, Captain Lewis moved on to other cases. That is, until June of 1998, when Captain Lewis was sitting in his office doing some work, when he suddenly got a call from the crime lab about the hand. An employee told Captain Lewis they had finally made a breakthrough. When they couldn't get the prints off this hand at first, they had moved to this very complicated technique where basically they would peel individual layers of skin off the hand and sort of piece together all the information to get a print. And amazingly, this technique worked. And so not only did they now have this print, but they had also already run this print through the Florida State database, and they had gotten a match. The hand belonged to a man named Willie Suttle. As soon as he hung up, Captain Lewis opened up a new tab on his computer and began researching Willie Suttle to figure out who this person was. And he quickly found through public employment records that Willie had been a retired garbage collector, and then also Captain Lewis looked at police records and discovered that Willie had a minor criminal history. But what really stood out in his research about Willie was that Willie had never been reported missing. Willie had instead been reported dead. Right there in the public records that Captain Lewis was looking at, he found Willie's death certificate. And this document said Willie had died of natural causes 5 months prior to his hand washing up on shore. And also it said Willie had been buried in a local cemetery, and no police had ever been involved in his death because no crime had been committed. And so Captain Lewis was baffled. None of this made any sense. If Willie had died of natural causes and been buried over a year ago, then how did his hand, his severed hand, wind up on the shore of the Manatee River? The next day, which was Friday, June 26th, Captain Lewis, along with a few other police officers, went to the cemetery where Willie had been buried, and they exhumed his casket. And when they opened it up, they actually expected it to be empty, considering his hand was already missing, so probably his whole body was gone. But no, when they opened it up, there was Willie, missing his left hand. But that wasn't all. At the bottom of Willie's casket were all of his internal organs, just sitting there in a rotting pile. And so Captain Lewis is staring at this, having no idea what to make of it. But the first thought he had was, okay, maybe somebody tried to rob Willie's casket. But he's thinking, if they did that, why did they cut out his organs and stash them at the bottom of the casket? And also, why did they remove his left hand and chuck it in the river? Like, that doesn't make any sense. It felt like every clue Captain Lewis found was only making this case harder to solve. But he hoped when he sent off Willie's body to the county medical examiner that they would be able to provide him with some more answers as to what happened here. Later that afternoon, the county medical examiner would perform an autopsy on Willie's body. And the first thing he noticed when he began was that despite the fact that Willie's organs clearly had been removed, that Willie's abdomen did not appear sunken in. It appeared full. So the medical examiner started the autopsy by cutting open Willie's abdomen to see what was in there. And when he saw what was inside of Willie, he just froze, having no idea how to react to what he was looking at. He had never seen anything like this in his entire career, not even close. And so the medical examiner just grabbed a camera, took some pictures of Willie's midsection, and sent those pictures to Captain Lewis. The next day, Captain Lewis sat inside of an interview room in the police station across from a 45-year-old woman named Paula Green Albritton. Paula owned and operated a funeral home along with the help of her son, and she had been the one responsible for Willie Suttle's burial. And so Captain Lewis asked Paula about Willie's burial, and she would tell him that Willie had actually died in poverty, without any family members to help cover his burial expenses. However, when Paula had found out about this, she said she had agreed to do the burial anyways, for no cost, as sort of a community service. However, when Captain Lewis poked and prodded and tried to ask for more information about exactly what that meant, Paula would eventually concede that there actually was slightly more to her rationale behind wanting to do Willie's burial. It was not just for charity. 2 days after this interview, police arrested both Paula and her son. And at Paula's trial, the truth surrounding what happened to Willie finally came out. It would turn out Paula's funeral home business was really struggling, to the point where if she couldn't start generating some real money, her business might go under. And she couldn't have that. And so Paula decided she would conduct a prosperity ritual to right her business. But to perform this prosperity ritual, Paula needed a body. And so along comes Willie Suttle, who's died in poverty and his family can't afford his funeral. And Paula says, don't worry, I'll take him on for free. But really what she needed was Willie's body. And once Paula and her son had possession of Willie's body, they began the ritual, which started with Paula's son carefully cutting off Willie's left hand. And then the two of them cut Willie's midsection open, removed all his internal organs. And then Paula got out all these voodoo dolls, and she wrote on pieces of paper the names of the other funeral homes, her competitors in the area, and she pinned these pieces of paper to each of these voodoo dolls. And then she took those voodoo dolls and jammed them inside of Willie's abdomen in the empty cavity they had created, and then they stitched him back up. And then she took Willie's body and his organs, and she chucked them into a cheap casket and had him buried. And then she also took the hand that her son had removed, she put it inside of a plastic bag, added some weight to it, and chucked it into the Manatee River. Paula believed this voodoo ritual would literally cause the owners of the other funeral homes, whose businesses she wrote down on the dolls and jammed inside of Willie's body, that this ritual would literally cause all of them to be struck down and killed, putting their businesses out of business, thereby leading to her business prospering once again. However, none of these things came to fruition. The ritual did not work the way Paula intended it to. Instead, the hand that she had thrown into the river ultimately washed ashore, and before long, the police figured out what Paula and her son had done. In 1999, so 2 years after Willie's hand had washed up on shore, Paula and her son were found guilty of desecrating Willie's corpse. Paula's son ultimately served 1 year in prison. As for Paula, her conviction was actually quickly overturned due to a technicality. It was discovered that during an interview with Paula, that police detectives told her that she could not be convicted if this ritual was part of a religious practice, that she was protected under the US Constitution. And so Paula, who confessed to doing this ritual, did so by saying it was part of her religion. She practiced voodoo.
I am a voodooist, and I've survived because I know how to survive. Mm-hmm. And that's a part of my religion.
And so in court, that confession was ruled inadmissible. And so she walked free. Here is a photo of the 12 voodoo dolls found inside of Willie's body, with the notes Paula wrote cursing her competition still attached.
Are you the type of person who has binged basically all of my YouTube videos, and every week you anxiously wait a new upload? If so, thank you, but also you're in luck. Because if you didn't know this, we actually have a separate podcast, the MrBallen podcast, that has literally hundreds of stories that are not on YouTube that you can binge right now. That podcast is available on all podcast platforms. Again, it's just called the MrBallen podcast. And on Mondays on that podcast, we upload exclusive new content that is not on YouTube to the podcast. So that's Mondays. And then on Thursday, we remaster the audio of your favorite videos on YouTube and put those on the podcast. But again, Mondays, those are brand new and exclusive to the podcast. But if you want to hear those exclusive episodes 1 month ahead of Apple and Spotify and all the other platforms, well, there's only one place you can do that, and that's on Amazon Music. So again, you can go to any podcast platform and find the MrBallen podcast, or if you're like me and you hate waiting, then you can listen early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Today's story is a claustrophobic nightmare. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to go skydiving with the like button, but be sure to replace their parachute with a trash bag. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. A little after 3 p.m. on March 22, 1959, a 20-year-old British college student named Neil Moss stood in a cavern about 1,000 feet underground in northern England. And as he stood there, he was staring with excitement into this dark hole right in front of him. The cavern that Neil was standing inside of was known as Peak Cavern, and it was one of the biggest and most twisting cave systems in the entire country. In fact, it was so big that at one point, an entire village of 30 rope makers lived inside of this cave. And then also, after those rope makers, the cave system became a hideout for criminals and thieves because there were so many secret passageways and basically places to hide inside of this system. So basically, Peak Cavern was a pretty famous place. And as a result, basically all of it had been mapped out or at least explored by scientists and spelunkers, except for this hole right in front of Neil. It was an entrance to a tunnel that nobody even knew about. Neil and the amateur exploration group that he was a part of had discovered this entryway about 2 weeks earlier. Now, neither Neil nor anybody else in this group had actually gone into this hole yet, and the reason for that was it was pretty dangerous. I mean, the opening to this tunnel was pretty small. It was 1.5 feet by 2 feet wide at the opening, and just looking down into it, I mean, it's a dark hole that you really can't tell how tight or how far it even goes. And so once you went inside of it, you know, the deeper you got, the higher the risk of entrapment. And so whoever actually went into this hole really needed to be prepared. But Neil and the rest of his amateur exploration group really felt like it would be worth it to try to go down this tunnel. Not just because nobody had done it before, but specifically, they thought there was a chance that beyond this tunnel, basically deep underground, if you followed it long enough, it could lead to another big open chamber that nobody had found before. And those types of big open chambers, whoever finds them gets it named after them. And so Neil and his group were thinking, you know, hey, if we find this big chamber, you know, it'll be named after us. We'll be famous, at least in, you know, spelunking circles. But they also understood that there might be nothing at the other end of this tunnel. It could just be a dead end. But the only way to know for sure would be if one of the members of this group went into the hole. Now, in addition to a fear of being trapped in the hole, there were other big issues with blindly crawling into a tunnel no one's been in before. Like, for example, there could be a sudden drop-off, or running water, or some other hazard that whoever went into the hole wouldn't know about until they were facing it. And so naturally, everybody in this group was excited about the hole, but also a little apprehensive about being the guinea pig to actually go into the hole. And so after the group had kind of stood around the hole for a minute, kind of talking through who was going to do it, Neil had finally courageously volunteered to be the guinea pig. He would go down. And in many ways, Neil was kind of like the perfect candidate for this job. He was smart, he was strong, and most importantly, he was thin, which meant he could navigate a really tight space. The only drawback to Neil was he was pretty tall. He was over 6 feet. And generally speaking, the best cavers in the world are very short and thin because it allows them to get into the smallest, tightest spaces underground. And so Neil, who was standing over the hole, began to mentally prepare himself for what he was about to do. He pulled out his flashlight and he shined it straight down into this hole, which again is a pretty narrow hole, and it basically went straight down. And as he was shining it, he saw about 12 feet down, the hole kind of turned and you couldn't see what was beyond it. And so Neil knew the only part of this trip he would know about is that first 12 feet. Once he made that turn, I mean, everything beyond that was totally unknown. Literally no one in the world knew what was beyond it, but Neil was about to find out. The cave explorers anchored this 75-foot-long wire ladder that was all rolled up to this rock that was inside the cavern, right near the opening to this hole. Once that was in place, they spooled out the ladder and kind of dumped it down into the hole. And so it fell 12 feet down and landed right where this tunnel turned and sort of went into oblivion, where nobody knows what happened after that. And so Neil, his job was going to be to go into this hole feet first, go down 12 feet, and then with his feet, as he kind of blindly crawled backwards feet first into the tunnel, he'd be kicking with his feet this ladder, extending it farther and farther into this tunnel. The idea was this ladder was his way back out again. So he's basically on top of the ladder, making his way, and at any point he can just grab the ladder and climb back out again. And so once the ladder was in place and all the cave explorers were kind of waiting for Neil, Neil walked up to the edge of the hole, he took a deep breath, and then he swung one leg into the hole, placed it on one of the rungs of the ladder, put his other leg on the ladder as well, and kind of tested it to make sure the rock that was anchoring the ladder could hold his weight. Once he was sure it could, he said goodbye to the explorers and then began his descent, feet first, down into the hole. As Neil slowly and carefully climbed down this ladder during this first 12-foot section, he felt the walls of this hole closing in on him. When he was close to the bottom of this first section, the walls were literally flush with his shoulders and back. I mean, this was a really tight space. And so finally he got to the very bottom of this 12-foot section, and he was about to step onto what he thought was another rung, because he can't actually see where he's going. He's just using his feet to feel. And he stepped down and he felt something hard. It was the ground. So he had reached the bottom of the 12-foot section. He kind of tested the ground with his foot, seeing if it would support his weight. And after feeling confident, he stepped off the ladder and just stood at the bottom of the hole. At this point, Neil used his feet to kick the ladder that was still coiled up at the bottom of the hole into the next turn, into the next section of the tunnel that he'd be going down. And as soon as he kicked it, he heard it kind of spool out as it tumbled down this next section. However, it was not a straight drop like this first section was. This next section he'd be going into was more of a gradual decline, just based on the sound this ladder was making as it tumbled down. And so after the ladder had stopped making noise and he knew it had stopped, Neil gave one final look up at his friends above, gave them a little wave, even though he could barely move his hands because it's so tight around him. And then he got down on his stomach and, feet first, began shimmying himself down into this next section. Now, during the first 12 feet and during the initial turn into this new section, Neil had been able to turn his head and basically look down and see where his feet were going. But after only a few feet of going into this new section, the walls had become so tight on his body that he couldn't even move his head. He really was blind and had no idea where he was going. Now, for a lot of people, this would have been a claustrophobic nightmare. Neil is in this unbelievably tight space. He has no idea what's gonna happen next. He doesn't know if it's gonna get so tight he'll get wedged in there. It's cold, it's damp. I mean, it's pitch black in there. He does have a headlamp, but his head is like kind of pressed to the ground and he can't really move it. So, he's not really able to look around him. And periodically, as he was shimmying his way down deeper into this tunnel, he would dislodge rocks from the wall and he would hear them strike the wall as they tumbled down into oblivion. He had no idea if these rocks were tumbling into a dead end or if they were tumbling off a ledge somewhere, a ledge that he wouldn't be aware of until he got to it. But for Neil, this environment was something he thrived in. It was why he was so drawn to cave exploration. As much as cave exploring was a physical exercise and a physical test, it was much more a mental test. I mean, can you handle being in these tight spaces and persevering and continuing on when you're all by yourself and it's like dangers all around you? And also, Neil just loved being alone and in the dark. So cave exploration was like perfect for him. When Neil had made it about 10 feet down this new section, his feet touched the rolled up section of the ladder. And so with his toes, he kind of gave it a kick and the ladder tumbled for a second and he could hear it. And then it just kind of vanished altogether, like the ladder had gone over a cliff. And so Neil realized, very likely, just beyond his feet, even though he cannot see it, is a ledge, and very likely either a drop-off or a new cavern. The thing they hope is on the other end of this tunnel. And so this was exciting for Neil. He felt a rush of adrenaline. There's a new turn in the tunnel, and for all he knows, this is the cavern they're looking for. Or it's just another section of tunnel he would have to explore. But either way, he's making progress. And so Neil very carefully scooched backwards until he felt the edge, at which point he let his legs go over the edge, he found his footing on the ladder, and it was at this point when he kind of turned around a little bit that he could see this was not some big open cavern he had found, it was just a turn in the tunnel system. It was now going back to basically a vertical hole, big enough to fit inside of, but Neil has no idea how deep it goes or what it leads to. But Neil was totally undeterred. He lowered his whole body into the section, got on the ladder, and began descending. And very quickly, as he began this descent, the walls of this section, this new vertical section, were so tight, it was about 18 inches in diameter, that he actually couldn't just go straight down. His body didn't fit just trying to maneuver down. So the only way he could get himself to go down further was to shimmy himself side to side like a corkscrew, basically forcing his body deeper and deeper into this hole. And so Neil continued doing this for an additional 18 feet down in this new section of tunnel, which put him at a total of 40 feet down into this tunnel from the entrance where the rest of his friends were. And when he got down there, 18 feet down, he went to step onto the rung to continue his descent, but his foot hit rock. And he felt around with his feet, and he realized this tunnel did not lead to a big new chamber. It instead was a dead end after all. Now, just to be sure, Neil actually kicked as hard as he could. He's kind of restricted, but he kicked with his legs as much as he could to see if maybe this wasn't a true dead end. Maybe it was just an obstruction and he could clear it. But he could tell, after a few stomps, This was not moving. This really was the end. Now, part of Neil was disappointed because he was hoping that by doing this, they would discover this big new chamber and they'd get it named after them. But on the other hand, he was also relieved because by this point, it was extremely claustrophobic, even for a guy who thrived in this environment. You know, by the bottom of this 40-foot section, he is completely wedged in place. And so Neil decided it was time to head back to the surface. But from where he was at, he couldn't even hear his friends. He's way down deep in this tunnel, it's totally pitch black. And so what he needed to do was just begin climbing back up this ladder. And then, about halfway up, he could call up to his friends and tell them, hey, I'm returning. But remember, to get to where Neil is, he has literally forced his body down into this tiny hole, basically corkscrewing himself as deep as he could get. And so he's totally restricted, and his arms are basically by his side, and his hands are basically pinned in front of his body. And so Neil tried to grab the ladder, which is literally pressed up against his chest, to begin the ascent. But even though his fingers could touch the rungs of the ladder, he couldn't actually move his arms to pull himself up the ladder. He could just hold the rung, that was it. But Neil had been in similar situations before, and what you do is you just use your legs. You drive with your legs and push your body up until your arms can go above your head, and then you continue the ascent. However, his legs also were basically in the same situation. It was so unbelievably tight around his legs that he couldn't lift his legs up. He could just basically wiggle his feet. Basically, there was no way physically for Neil to get himself out. He would need his team up above to pull him out. And so Neil began shouting as loud as he could, trying to get the attention of his friends up above, telling them, hey, I'm stuck, pull me out. And then also, as best as he could with his hands on the rung, he kind of pulled on the ladder, signaling to them like, hey, get me out of here. Now, he couldn't really hear anything up above. It was sort of muffled, and he couldn't tell if they were yelling back down to him. But as he was holding onto the ladder, he felt a little bit of tension, suggesting they were pulling on him. However, as he held on, waiting to be pulled up and out, he didn't budge. Like, despite the tension on this ladder clearly coming from the surface from his friends, he wasn't moving. And that's when Neil realized he had made a critical mistake. When he had reached the bottom of this tunnel, when he realized it was a dead end, he had stomped with his feet to confirm it really was a dead end. And when he had done that, he had inadvertently kicked the rungs of this ladder into a crevice, and then rocks, which he had heard kind of falling when he was kicking, landed on top of it, basically pinning the ladder in place. Basically, this ladder was now anchored inside the cave, which meant no matter how hard his friends on the surface pulled, they would not be able to pull the ladder up, which meant they couldn't pull Neil up. And Neil, once he realized this was the issue, he tried to move his feet to clear the rocks off the bottom of the ladder, but he couldn't. It was too tight around him. And so Neil was totally stuck. As many of you may know, aside from telling stories on this YouTube channel, I also tell stories on my flagship podcast, the MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories. And in addition to that podcast, we over at Ballen Studios actually have a whole slate of other incredible strange, dark, and mysterious podcasts for you to enjoy. If you're into baffling and horrifying medical mysteries, well, check out my other podcast I host called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Or maybe you want to hear somebody else from Ballen Studios with a far better radio voice tell you a story, like Luke LaManna. Luke has two podcasts under the Ballen Studios umbrella. One is called Wartime Stories, which sort of mirrors what he does on YouTube, also called Wartime Stories. It's like the strange, dark, and mysterious meets the battlefield. And he also has a show called Redacted. It's brand new, and it delves into government conspiracies and cover-ups. It's wild. Ballen Studios also has shows that are just pure nightmare fuel, like Bedtime Stories with host Richard Weil, who looks into cryptid encounters, supernatural deaths, the paranormal, and everything in between. It's really good. And then, of course, we have Run Fool, hosted by the iconic Rodney Barnes, who's like a true pioneer in the horror space. We were so lucky to be able to collaborate with him, and his show, which sort of delves into terrifying folklore, is just one of a kind. You gotta check it out. So if any of these shows appeal to you, make sure you go check them out by just going to any podcast platform and looking up Ballen Studios, and boom, you'll see all of our shows. Make sure you follow along and tune in each week for new episodes. The members of Neil's exploration group pretty much immediately realized this was a crisis, because not only was Neil stuck in this cave, but in these tight little tunnels underground, there's limited oxygen. So it's not just a matter of, oh, we'll figure it out and get Neil out somehow. It's like, no, you have a limited amount of time before Neil runs out of oxygen down there. Even if you come up with a solution, it might be too late. And so immediately, members of the exploration group left Peak Cavern to go get help. And before long, over 200 people had flooded the cavern, including a mountain rescue unit and a coal mining extraction team and a whole bunch of civilians who were all there to try to figure out how to get Neil out. Now, at first, Neil was very optimistic about his recovery. He could hear clearly all the commotion 40 feet above him. He couldn't fully discern what was going on there, but he could clearly tell a major rescue operation was afoot. And so as ropes were cast down and ladders were cast down to try to get him out, and they continued to fail, and as the air he was breathing began to thin out and it was getting harder to breathe, Neil's reaction was to kind of be positive. He actually began cracking jokes and calling up like, hey, how much longer do I have to wait down here? But as the minutes turned into hours and none of the efforts by any of the rescuers were working, Neil began to panic. His heart was racing, not only from his nerves, but also because he was running out of oxygen. He had begun to grit his teeth really hard to kind of control his fear, but he was really starting to lose it. At one point, the rescuers threw down an oxygen mask for him to breathe because it was clear the air was becoming a real issue. But even though the mask literally tumbled down and hit him right on the head, so it's right here, he couldn't get his arms up to put the mask on. And so there it is, salvation, but he couldn't use it. And so before long, Neil sort of began drifting in and out of consciousness. One moment he'd be calling up to his rescuers, asking for an update. The next, they'd call down to him and get no response. Clearly, this situation was becoming dire. Now, to this point, the way the rescue had gone was the rescuers were basically throwing equipment into the hole, be it ladders or ropes or oxygen masks for Neil to grab onto or put on him, and they were hoping that basically Neil could get himself out of the hole. Because the great fear was, if we send a rescuer, or rescuers plural, into this hole to get him, they could get stuck, and now we have an even bigger problem. But when Neil began losing consciousness, when they couldn't get him to call back to them, they knew they were genuinely running out of time. And so they began pumping oxygen into the hole to hopefully buy some extra time. And then they decided, we gotta send someone into the hole. Someone has to go in there, get Neil, and pull him out. And so one by one, these courageous rescuers went down into the hole, and 8 times they tried, and 8 times they failed. All 8 either got stuck along the way or they passed out along the way. 3 people actually reached Neil and actually touched Neil, but there was no way to grab him and pull him out. And so Neil, who was conscious for a lot of this, like he's hearing and literally in some cases seeing rescue. It's right there, it's right in front of him, but it just didn't work. By the time the 8th man was pulled back out of the hole, they could hear in the hole this horrible sound, which was Neil gasping for air. Even though they were attempting to pump air into this hole, it wasn't enough, and Neil just couldn't fill his lungs with enough oxygen. And so the rescuers yelled into the hole for Neil to just hold on. They were gonna get him out of there, just be strong, hold on. But by this point, Neil, he wasn't even saying anything back. He just continued making these awful gasping sounds. By about 7 p.m., when Neil had been stuck in this hole for 4 hours, the rescuers decided to send one more guy into this hole, this really small civilian. And he went down there with a rope to attach around Neil and hopefully pull him out. And this little civilian managed to get all the way down, all the way to Neil. And when he found Neil, Neil was unconscious, but alive. And the rescuer put the rope around Neil's shoulders and then signaled to the surface to begin pulling. And so from the surface, they pulled on this rope, and slowly but surely, Neil began to be pulled out of the hole. And he moved about 18 inches, being monitored by the civilian who was down there. However, because they were pulling so hard on this rope to get Neil to move, the pressure from that rope was basically crushing Neil's chest, and he stopped breathing. And the civilian who was down there with Neil noticed it and yelled up to the group to stop. And they had to take the rope off because, yeah, they might be able to pull him out this way, but they would kill him. He would suffocate. And so once the civilian rescuer came out of the hole, he told the group, like, look, Neil's body is simply too big to be yanked out of the hole safely. He needs to be conscious and able to contort and twist his body, basically undoing what Neil did to get down there.
in order to get out again. Like, we need his participation, and he's unconscious, so we can't do that. And so at this point, the rescuers were totally desperate. They know Neil is still alive. They can hear some of his ragged breathing coming out of the hole, but they knew they had to do something drastic right now or Neil was gonna die. And so they came up with this plan for this even smaller rescuer, this woman, to go down into the hole, get to Neil, and break his collarbone to try to shrink his body to be able to pull him out. And so this woman, she goes down there and she reaches Neil, but she failed to break his collarbone. And so she too had to come out of the hole, leaving Neil behind. And so once the woman came out of the hole, it became clear to the rescuers that Neil was not getting out of this hole, even though he was just 40 feet away and at this moment still very much alive. They could hear his ragged breathing, but there was just nothing anybody could do. And so one of the rescuers called Neil's father and told him, "You need to come out to Peak Cavern." Not long after that, Neil's father, Eric Moss, arrived at Peak Cavern. Now, he knew going into this that his son was stuck. That's why he got the phone call to come out here. But he did not understand just how dire the situation really was. But as soon as he got to Peak Cavern and saw all these vehicles outside and the hundreds of rescuers coming in and out of the cave with these sad, dark expressions on their faces, Eric knew this was really bad. And so Eric made his way into Peak Cavern, and for hours he just hoped and prayed that whatever was happening would be enough to get his son out. And for hours, Eric just stood there in Peak Cavern, hoping to see his son emerge from the hole, hoping to come up and say everything is okay, but he didn't. And things only got worse. It eventually began to rain, and unfortunately, Peak Cavern, and specifically the hole that Neil was stuck inside of, flood when it rains. And so as rainwater is pouring into this cavern and Neil is still alive but stuck in this hole, they had to make the heart-wrenching decision in front of Neil's father to abandon the operation and get out of the cave, knowing Neil was going to die. Rescuers were finally able to get back into Peak Cavern at about 3 a.m. on March 24th, which is approximately 36 hours after Neil got trapped. By this point, the rains had subsided, the flood had cleared, and so they went in there hoping for a miracle. And when they got to the hole and listened into it, they actually heard Neil still breathing. He was still alive, but it was very clear he was at the end of his life. And all they could do was just sit around this hole and listen as Neil took his last few final ragged breaths. And then eventually they listened as Neil took his final breath and the hole went silent. Now, at this point, it was too dangerous to send anybody back down into this hole, and so no one could get physically close enough to Neil to actually confirm that he really is dead. However, after the hole remained silent for quite a while, a doctor who was on site did walk over and declare Neil dead. And so at this point, the rescue operation became a recovery operation. However, as rescuers were getting ready to go back down into the hole to retrieve Neil's body, it was at this point that Neil's father, Eric Moss, who had been there this whole time and had been witness to the doctor declaring his son dead, it was at this point that he stepped in and said, "Stop, get everybody out of the cave. I don't want anybody else to lose their lives." And so ultimately, Eric made the decision to leave his son's body where it was. Eventually, once it was 100% certain that Neil really must be dead at this point, they would fill in the hole that Neil had climbed down inside of with loose rocks from the cave, entombing him inside of it forever. And in his memory, the tunnel that Neil died inside of was named after him. It's called Moss Chamber. I'm about to play you a clip from one of our Ballen Studios podcasts called Wartime Stories. After you're done listening, be sure to check them out on any podcast platform and give them a follow. New episodes every Monday. Enjoy.
The story you are about to hear comes from the front lines of World War I, a place where many men lost everything: their friends, their limbs, their lives. Some men survived, but lost something else: their minds. Perhaps born out of the delusions that any man might suffer when taken from his ordinary life and subjected to an unfamiliar and hellacious environment that pushes both his body and his mind to the breaking point. Some of these young men returned home with far more than the usual stories of combat. They spoke of something else that they encountered, something unnatural, a highly intelligent creature that prowled the frontline trenches. The men who might have assured us that what they saw was indeed real and not a figment of their imagination, they are now gone. But their incredible story remains. The story of the Hound of Mons.
Today's story is about one of the most famous paranormal events in history. But it's not famous because of how outlandish the details are. Instead, it's famous for its credibility. Not only were there 12 witnesses who saw this thing happen, but also there was a NASA engineer who investigated this event and ultimately concluded that it must have happened because of tangible proof. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's stick deodorant with cream cheese. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 9 p.m. on December 29, 1980, a 57-year-old woman named Vicki Landrum rode in the front seat of her friend Betty Cash's car, while her 7-year-old grandson, named Colby, who she was raising, sat between them. The three of them had just had dinner at a truck stop and were now on their way home, driving down a dark wooded highway near Huffman, Texas, which is a small town about 30 miles northeast of Houston. As they drove down the road, Vicki began to notice the windshield was fogging up from how cold it was outside and how warm it was inside the car. And so Vicki turned on the defroster. And as the windshield began to clear, Vicki noticed this bright light right out in front of them up over the trees. And at first, Vicki just figured, they were close to the Houston airport, and so that light must just be an airplane. But as the trio continued driving down this winding highway road, that light that Vicki really thought was a plane landing appeared to just kind of hover in the trees. And actually, as they drove, the light almost appeared to get closer and closer to them. So it didn't really seem like it was a plane. Now, at first, Vicki thought this was just kind of interesting and was curious about this light. But as they got closer and closer to this light, it became very obvious that the inside of the car was getting much warmer and stuffier than any of the heat settings would allow it to get, to the point where Vicki was actually sweating and panting from the heat. Now, all of this was happening really quickly, and so Vicki sort of went from being curious to being kind of anxious. Like, what was going on here? Like, does this light have something to do with the heat they're experiencing in the car? And then all of a sudden, the light that appeared to be sort of behind the trees suddenly came right out in front of the car, and Vicki screamed at Betty, "Stop!" And Becky jammed on the brakes, and they came to a stop, and blocking their path, maybe 100 feet in front of them, just hovering over the road, is this strange-looking aircraft aimed right at them. This craft was the strange light. For a moment, all three of them just stared in shock at this craft, like it was so unexpected and so unbelievable that this had happened. But then Vicki, who's sitting there still panting and sweating, she's looking out and she's realizing this craft she's looking at looks nothing like any other aircraft she had ever seen. The craft was a bit bigger than a car, it was diamond-shaped, and it was letting out these strange, loud roaring sounds, almost like an engine. It appeared to be glowing red hot, and periodically, with those loud roaring sounds it was making, fire would appear to shoot out the bottom of the craft, scorching the pavement right under it. And again, this strange craft is just hovering there right over the ground, appeared to be aimed directly at Vicki, Betty, and Colby. Pretty quickly, Colby began to cry. He was scared. But Betty, the driver, she said she couldn't go anywhere. The road was too thin. She couldn't really turn around very easily, and she couldn't drive straight and go under the craft and risk being burned by the flames. And so they were just kind of trapped there. And so Vicki and Betty sort of looked at each other like, okay, we're gonna wait it out and hope this craft just eventually flies away. But after several minutes, and the craft still had not departed, it was still blocking their way and periodically spitting fire into the ground, Vicki and Betty are like, well, let's get out and see what's going on here. Let's investigate. By this point, their fear and anxiety around this had sort of been replaced by just genuine human curiosity. I mean, what the heck is this thing? And so Betty, the driver, she gets out, and Vicki, she tells her grandson, stay in the car, so Colby's right here, and Vicki gets out, and the second she does, and she now has an unobstructed view at this craft, she suddenly remembered this Bible verse. So Vicky was very religious, and she had read in the Bible that one day Jesus would return to the earth, and when he did, he would return in a rain of fire. And so all of a sudden, Vicky believed that what she was looking at was not some aircraft, but the second coming of Jesus Christ. This was like a highly spiritual moment for her. But just as Vicky was about to go forward and actually inspect this thing up close, she heard Colby call out for her. He was crying hysterically. He was totally scared and upset. And so this kind of broke Vicky out of her trance. She turned around and went back to the car to comfort Colby. And when she got back to the car, she found Colby scrunched up on the floor underneath the dashboard like he was trying to shield himself from this craft. And so Vicky, she got right down there with him. She wrapped her arms around Colby and began praying with him to try to calm him down. But while Vicky and Colby were praying inside the car, Betty remained outside of the car, just staring at this craft. And it went on like this for about 10 minutes until Vicky, who's still tucked down there with Colby, heard that roaring sound coming from the aircraft get noticeably louder, like it was about to do something. And so Vicky poked her head up and she looked out the windshield, and sure enough, this craft was beginning to take off. It was getting higher and higher off the ground. Flames were shooting out the bottom of it. Betty was still outside staring at it. And then before long, this craft had shot straight up into the air and began taking off up and away from them at a really steep angle. And at the same time, Vicky suddenly saw this swarm of all these helicopters, these military-style helicopters, go right up around this craft like they were escorting it. And then the craft and all these helicopters took off into the horizon and disappeared. After they were all gone, Vicky realized that what she had just witnessed was not the second coming of Christ. Because of these military helicopters that arrived as this craft took off, it told Vicky and also Betty that very likely this was just a US military exercise of some sort. And so a few moments later, Betty came back to the car and sat in the driver's seat, and Vicky, she climbed back into her seat and lifted Colby up to the middle seat as well. And for a moment, the three of them just sat there in silence. I mean, there's nothing blocking their way anymore. They're just sort of trying to process what just happened. Eventually, Betty just put the car in drive and began driving straight ahead, crossing right over that scorch mark on the pavement where the craft had been. About 45 minutes later, Betty pulled up to Vicky's house and parked the car. Vicky and Colby, they got out, they said goodbye to Betty. They didn't really talk about what they had just seen, they just said goodnight. And then Vicky and Colby headed inside the house. And as much as both of them did have things to say about whatever it was they saw, they just continued not to talk about it. They both were just kind of eager to go to bed. However, as Vicky was putting Colby to bed, he began to complain that his stomach hurt, and at the same time, Vicky began to realize that she also didn't feel very well. And shortly after that, both of them were vomiting in the bathroom. And this scared Vicky. She tried to tell herself that, maybe the reason they were sick is because they ate some bad food at that truck stop. But deep down, Vicky was very concerned that their nausea was somehow connected to that strange craft. And so it was a very long night, with Vicky and Colby being nauseous most of the time, but eventually they both did fall asleep. And then when Vicky got up the next morning, she still felt awful. And so Vicky, she rolled out of bed and made her way to the bathroom. And when she looked at herself in the mirror, she gasped. Her skin was bright red and blistered, like she had had this horrible sunburn. At this point, she knew whatever was going on here, it had to do with that craft. She just knew it. And so Vicky instinctively rushed to Colby's room to check on him to see if his skin was all blistered and red, and she found he was still sleeping, but she could see his skin was red and blistered in some places, but not nearly as bad as Vicky's. And so Vicky, she began thinking about the night before, and she remembered she had gotten out of the car and gotten closer to the craft. So she was sort of more exposed to the craft, if you will, than Colby, who stayed in the car and tucked himself down underneath the dashboard the whole time. And so maybe Vicky's exposure to the craft was higher than Colby's, which is why she looked worse. But as Vicky was thinking this through, she remembered that Betty had actually stayed outside the car for 10-15 minutes, much longer than Vicky had, the whole time just staring directly at this craft. And so immediately Vicky was worried that, if this is what happened to me, I can only imagine what shape Betty is in. And so Vicky ran to the phone, she picked it up and she dialed Betty's number, and she listened, and it just kept on ringing and ringing. Betty didn't answer. Now, at this point, Vicky was in a full-blown panic. Not only because she was worried about Betty, but also, she doesn't really know what's wrong with her or with Colby. She doesn't know if their sickness is going to get worse or better. Currently, she felt horrible. She was nauseous. Her skin seemed to be practically falling off. Colby was in less bad shape, but still not healthy. And also, Vicky didn't have the money to even go to the doctor to get looked at. And so as much as Vicky really wanted right now to just go check on Betty, go drive to her house and check on her,
She couldn't. She needed to focus on herself and her grandson first and make sure they were okay before she did anything else. And so over the next few days, Vicky and Colby stayed home. They slowly regained their strength. And over those few days, Vicky actually would get Betty on the phone. And Betty would tell her that yes, she's also dealing with similar symptoms, but she was okay, which was very reassuring to Vicky. However, Vicky also knew that Betty was not a complainer, and even if she did have horrendous symptoms, she was not the type of person who would necessarily tell Vicky. She would sort of tough it out. Finally, after 5 days, Vicky felt strong enough to go check on Betty in person. However, when she got to Betty's house and went inside, she called out for Betty, but there was no answer. The house was eerily quiet. And so Vicky began walking around Betty's house looking for Betty, and eventually Vicky walked down a hallway and reached Betty's bedroom, and the door was shut. Vicky called out for Betty, but there was no answer from inside. And so feeling kind of scared at this point, Vicky reached down, she turned the handle and opened the door, and immediately she saw Betty on her bed. And Betty looked horrible. She was barely conscious. Her entire body was red and blistered and bleeding. There was vomit all over the bed sheets, and there were all these huge clumps of Betty's hair littering her pillow. And so Vicky was horrified. She rushed inside, she scooped her friend up, and between the two of them, they kind of hobbled out of the house. Vicky put Betty in her car, and they sped to the hospital. A few hours later, Vicky was waiting in the emergency room where Betty was being treated, when Betty's doctor walked into the waiting room, at which point Vicky stood up and rushed over to him and said, "Hey, what's going on with Betty? What happened to her? What's going on?" But the doctor just shook his head and said, your friend, her skin is literally peeling off her face in sheets, and there are blisters breaking out all over her body. He told Vicky that her symptoms reminded him of radiation poisoning. However, he also told Vicky that that was basically impossible. For Betty, a woman who lives in rural Texas, where would she go to come in contact with something that radioactive? It just seemed not possible, so that couldn't be it. But Vicky, when she heard this, felt like she knew exactly how Betty came in contact with something highly radioactive. It had to be that craft. And so without even thinking about it, Vicky began pouring out the story of how her and Betty had seen this light, and then this craft appeared on the road, and it was shooting fire, and then it flew off with helicopters all around it. But as she was wrapping up her story, Vicky was suddenly overcome with embarrassment because the doctor was now staring at her like she was totally out of her mind.
Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. As many of you may already know, therapy really changed my life when I got out of the military in 2017. But that change did not happen overnight. It took months before I had any sort of breakthrough, and during those months, it was often pretty uncomfortable for me. It's hard enough just internally thinking about your deepest, darkest issues. And so now imagine, sitting in front of somebody you don't really know, pouring your heart out about these really sensitive things. It was a lot at first. Gradually, the more I showed up and continued working with my therapist, the more I sort of let my ego down and allowed the therapist to do their job. And over time, I really discovered that therapy is a very freeing experience. Being able to speak openly about these things that are troubling you to somebody who is non-judgmental and can offer really distinct feedback and perspective that you just simply can't because you are yourself. You kind of think of yourself one way, but the world sees you another. That was really amazing for me. And so if you're struggling right now and you don't really know what to do about it, consider giving therapy a try. And one very accessible therapy option is BetterHelp. BetterHelp is on a mission to make starting therapy easier. It's entirely online, and all you have to do is fill out a quick questionnaire online, and then you'll be matched with a licensed therapist in as little as 2 days. And if for some reason you don't vibe with your therapist, you don't like them, you can switch therapists as many times as you want at no additional cost. If you're struggling and think you might benefit from a therapy session, click the link in the description below or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen for 10% off your first month of therapy.
A month later, in early February of 1981, Vicky was at her kitchen table with the phone pressed to her ear. She was calling her local senator, who she had already written to try to tell him about the strange aircraft she had seen that made her friend sick. But Vicky did not have high hopes about this phone call, because she had already been ignored so many times by so many people when it came to this story. So by this point, Vicky and her grandson Colby had basically recovered from their nausea and their burns. However, Betty had not recovered. She was still cycling in and out of the hospital, she was in constant pain, she still had burns all over her, and in fact, because of all these symptoms, she had had to move in with her brother. Now, Vicky was certain that all these symptoms Betty had were radiation sickness caused by the radiation from this aircraft they came in contact with, but it was like everybody they told about this aircraft didn't believe them. Just then, Vicky heard a woman's voice break through the hold music. It was the local senator's secretary. And so Vicky quickly explained why she was calling and why she really wanted to talk to the local senator, but the secretary just told Vicky that, yep, she'll pass this along to the senator and he'll be in touch. And then she hung up. And for Vicky, this was the moment she snapped. She felt like trying to navigate the proper channels to try to figure out what this aircraft was and what happened to Betty was not working because clearly nobody was taking her seriously. And so Vicky slammed the phone down and just sat there frustrated, having no idea what to do. But as she sat there, Vicky remembered there was actually one place she had not called yet, specifically because she didn't want to call this place. It was a UFO research center. And Vicky hadn't called because she did not believe the craft she had seen was a UFO. She believed it was a military aircraft because she had seen the helicopters escorting it away, and that made the most sense. It had to be military. But if she called the UFO research center and people found out about that, it would make her look even crazier because now she's claiming the craft was aliens or something. But now Vicky felt like she had run out of options. So she picked up the phone, grabbed the piece of paper with the number on it, and dialed. A couple days later, a scientist named John Schuessler drove down the winding wooded highway into Huffman, Texas. He was going to meet up with Vicky. John was an aerospace engineer for NASA. However, he also spent a lot of time investigating UFO sightings. Vicky's call to that UFO research center had created a lot of excitement in the UFO community, and the story had eventually found its way to John, who decided he would take on the case. Now, to be clear, John was not into researching UFO sightings in order to prove they really happened. Actually, it was sort of the opposite. He would look into reported UFO sightings in order to prove they were not UFOs. He would find a rational, scientific explanation that debunked the sighting. That's sort of what he did. And so with Vicky's case, that was his intention, to go to Huffman, Texas, talk to Vicky, and explain away with science and rationale what happened here. That this was not, aliens. This was something ordinary, like a government aircraft. And so John eventually got to Vicky's house, and he went inside and he chatted with Vicky, and she talked him through all the details of the story. And then eventually, they both left Vicky's house, they hopped in their respective cars, and headed out to go to the actual site where this had happened. And when they got there, and John got out of the car, he didn't need Vicky to direct him to the specific site, because right in front of him was this really obvious black circle right in the middle of the road, as if the road itself had been melted and then re-solidified and actually looked different. And Vicky said, that's where it was. That's where the craft was hovering. Those marks are from the craft. Now, this was great evidence that a craft really had been here, but John wanted more. He needed to figure out what kind of craft this really was. And so he told Vicky he was going to leave and go canvass the area for witnesses, and he told her he would keep her updated. So Vicky left, and John drove up the road until he reached some campsites and farmhouses. And John systematically went from door to door and tent to tent, asking anybody if they had seen or heard any aircraft or anything strange on the night of December 29th. Now, going into this, John didn't really know what to expect from these people he was asking. I mean, he's some random scientist showing up uninvited at people's homes, asking if they'd seen strange lights in the sky. However, every single person he spoke to said that yes, they had seen that aircraft on December 29th. However, they were obviously just farther away than Vicky and Betty and Colby had been. So now, John felt like he had enough information to speak directly with military officials. However, when he contacted all the military bases in the area, all those officials he spoke to told him absolutely that on December 29th, there were 0 military operations happening. John found this very frustrating because to him, it seemed very clear that these officials were just lying to him. But what they were lying about and why was unclear. So John actually went to these military bases to speak to the officials face to face. And when he did, he showed them all the witness testimonies saying what they had seen on December 29th. And he also told them that with his own eyes, he had seen the black scorched mark on the pavement, where the pavement seemed to have literally melted in a ring and re-solidified from the heat of this craft. And to John, I mean, that scorch mark almost proved something had been there, very likely a military craft. But all these military leaders, despite hearing this and hearing John's testimony, they just said, you know what, you can gather up all the evidence you think you have here, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't prove that we were in the area. There was no military craft there that night. And so the bottom line was, the military was adamant they were not involved. And so the case really began to stall. John went home, but he couldn't stop thinking about the case, and so he kept in touch with his witnesses and periodically checked in with military officials, but nothing seemed to change. Except that Betty continued to get sicker and sicker, and Vicky actually began to develop other serious symptoms, like developing cataracts in one of her eyes. And then John got a frantic call from one of his witnesses. They told him they had just seen something truly incredible. And as John listened to the story, he felt his heart sink, because now he knew the military had been lying to him about being out there on December 29th. Clearly they had been, and very likely it was their aircraft that had made Betty, Vicky, and Colby so sick. But now, John also knew that any hope he had of proving this was now literally gone, because the witness told him that black government vehicles had rolled up to the incident site out on that road, and they'd come along with construction vehicles, and for no clear traffic-related reason, they had cut up one particular stretch of that road, taken it with them, and left. And that particular stretch of road that was removed just happened to be the exact spot where that scorch mark had been left by the craft. It was like they were taking the evidence and getting rid of it. Now, John himself was not able to literally go back to the road and see for himself where the pavement had been cut. However, not long after John learned this information, a group of UFO scientists descended on the road to find this scorch mark, or to prove it had been cut out and taken away like the witness had said. And sure enough, when they got out there, they didn't find the scorch mark. Instead, they found nice, fresh, brand new pavement. The strange event that Vicky, Betty, and Colby experienced on the night of December 29, 1980, is widely considered to be one of the most famous and credible UFO sightings of all time. It's now known as the Cash Landrum incident, after Betty and Vicky's last names, and to this day, nobody has been able to come up with a rational explanation for what happened if it wasn't a UFO. To this day, the US government maintains that they did not have any military operations happening on December 29th. However, they did say when it comes to cutting out the road and paving over it, that was just for routine maintenance. They were not trying to hide evidence. As for Vicky and Betty, over the years, their health continued to deteriorate. They ultimately filed a lawsuit against the government, but because they couldn't actually prove that the aircraft even existed or that it caused their health problems, their lawsuit was ultimately dismissed. Both women would eventually die from cancer, which Colby believes is a direct result from radiation exposure. As for Colby, he's still alive and continuing to seek answers. The official MrBallen podcast YouTube channel is back. This channel is the home for our exclusive MrBallen podcast episodes that you can't get anywhere else on YouTube. Which means if you have not been listening to the MrBallen podcast on podcasting platforms to this point, well, guess what? All those exclusive episodes, all that new content you missed out on is now going to be available to you on YouTube on this channel. And there are literally hundreds of new stories that have only been audio only to this point. And so we're talking about a whole bunch of new content for some of you. We post at least once a week on this channel, so make sure you subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss an episode. Also, to further entice you to check this channel out and hopefully subscribe to it, I have hidden a behind-the-scenes photo of me inside of my studio somewhere on this official MrBallen Podcast YouTube channel. So go over there, subscribe to it, and find that photo. Now, here is a teaser from one of the MrBallen Podcast episodes. Enjoy. To hear the full episode and so many other strange, dark, and mysterious stories that many of you may not have heard before, head on over to the MrBallen Podcast official YouTube channel and subscribe today.